these 2 weeks. This being said, I'm very happy to open this panel to start the summer school with 3 speakers who have kindly accepted to come with us this afternoon. And I will start with the first speaker, Daniel THYM, Professor Daniel THYM from Konstanz University in Germany, who is one of the pillars of the Odysseus network, a specialist of EU migration and asylum law. If you cannot sleep at night, I advise you to open what we call the Bible of EU migration asylum law, a book of 1,500 or 1,600 pages made of a commentary of each instrument. And Daniel is now preparing the 3rd edition of that book. And he will introduce the subject of the Pact, also because you may have seen that on our blog we have published during 6 months a series of posts about the Pact, analyzing in depth the different aspects and the content of the Pact. The second speaker will be Mr. Raoul UBERECKEN, who comes from the Council of Ministers and who is there in charge of Justice and Home Affairs, but who is following especially the migration and asylum policy, a hot issue that came up a few days ago at the agenda of the European Council, surprisingly, because it was not foreseen. And we are very grateful that you accepted to come to join us today, and it will be particularly interesting to listen to you because the Council and the Member States is the most interesting institution for the moment. Of course, the Commission has already put on the table its proposal, so we know what the Commission is thinking. The European Parliament has not yet taken a position, and they have appointed the rapporteurs for the different parts of the Pact, but they are really at the very beginning of the work. There is not even a draft report, and the work will only seriously start on the content in September. And this is the reason why we do not have a representative of the European Parliament, because they will not be a lot to say due this situation. And then finally, last but not least, we have with us Jean-Louis de BROUWER, who is a director of the European program at a think tank, the Royal Institute for International Relations, but that everybody calls the Egmont Institute. But Jean-Louis de BROUWER is not only with us in this new capacity, he is also with us because he is one of the builders of the European migration and asylum policy that he followed when he was working in the Commission from the beginning of the 90s, and he passed through all the different treaties from the Single Act, Schengen, Maastricht, Nice, Amsterdam, and finally Lisbon. And he has, of course, an extraordinary experience of the development of the migration and asylum policy, in particular because he has been Deputy Director General at DG Home during this key period, in particular with the Treaty of Lisbon. So Daniel is going to set the scene in 30 minutes, or about 30 minutes, to explain the content and the different aspects of the Pact. Then we will listen to Mr. UBERECKEN and finally to Jean-Louis de BROUWER. We expect to make a coffee break around 3:45, 4 o'clock, but before that, the floor will be given to the audience, and you will have the possibility to make comments and to ask questions. I hope that you will enjoy this first session that I'm sure will be very interesting. And I give the floor to my colleague Daniel Tim.
Thanks indeed, Chair Philippe, for the kind introduction and indeed the opportunity to serve as an introductory speaker this afternoon. You have given me a difficult task since I feel torn apart between two different roles. On the one hand, I feel obliged and want to introduce you to the substance of the pact, which is highly complex to present and difficult to present even in 30 minutes. On the other hand, there are political and administrative dynamics both here in Brussels and on the ground at the external borders which require our attention. I've decided to structure my comments along the second aspect today, the political and operational dynamics from today's perspective, and I will use them as a groundwork for revisiting the contents of the Commission proposals presented last September. In doing so, I assume that most of you are familiar at least with the very basic contours of the pact presented last September. And I see a lot of people nodding, that's good. If that is not the case, I would suggest to those for whom words like border procedure or screening regulation are something they have never heard of to read the introductory blog post I've written for the special section mentioned by Philippe a minute ago. Apparently, it's available in your Teams folder to be consulted. In the introductory blog post, you will also find hyperlinks to more specialized articles written by eminent scholars from across Europe on different segments and aspects of the pact, which really go far beyond an introduction. They are a very detailed technical and also legal analysis. And these blog posts by experts touch upon various issues the pact deals with. They deal with Dublin, solidarity, and secondary movements. They also deal with the border procedure, detention, and the role of agencies at the external border. They deal with cooperation with third states, very generally, but also on the issue of return. They deal with boat arrivals, legal pathways for refugees, and also for economic migrants. And you see already that this is an extremely vast thematic and legislative tableau touching upon various different instruments. And you will see that this is part of the problem. The pact is so complex. It deals with so many different questions thematically and legally that it's very difficult, well, for all of us to have an overview. That's why the summer school is also so helpful and important, but it also has a knock-on effect on the political negotiations. There is an interdependency between the different subjects, which makes it very complex to find a compromise, because an agreement on topic A is related to topic B and topic C and topic D, and that creates a very complex overall picture, which is very tricky and difficult to deal with politically. In the coming minutes, I will present 5 more abstract arguments on the legislative, political, and operational developments, as I said earlier, from today's perspective, the summer of 2021, and I will use them as a background to revisit the contents of the Commission proposals. The first comment concerns political stalemate. Commissioner Johansson famously predicted that the proposal she presented in September would not be greeted with enthusiasm by anyone. Nevertheless, she hoped that the pact would present a pragmatic starting point for political negotiations precisely because the Commission had tried to respect the red lines several national governments had drawn beforehand. And the most important red line which the member states had drawn, you know quite well, it's the opposition of the Visegrad 4 to mandatory relocation. Commissioner Johansson proved correct insofar as the pact has not been shot down by the member states immediately. They negotiate at a technical level, and I assume we'll hear in a minute how negotiations within the Council are ongoing. There seems even to be a certain appetite to now adopt the EUAA, the EU Asylum Agency regulation, independently as a sort of confidence-building measure. You have also heard from Philippe that the European Parliament is progressing with its internal deliberations on the several dossiers. That is, of course, a good sign, but it's obviously insufficient to guarantee a success of the overall project. Why? Even if the European Parliament manages to find an internal compromise, it is only the co-legislator. Without the consent of the Parliament, nothing will be adopted. Remember or note that the European Parliament also managed to find a compromise on the Dublin IV regulation, which had been proposed by the Commission in 2016, but that was insufficient. Why? Because the member states didn't agree on their position in the Council. And even if the Council agreed on a position, they would then still have to find a compromise with the Parliament, of course. Unfortunately, agreement within the Council is complicated by very profound conflicts of interests among the member states. There are at least 4 groupings which you may distinguish, which have very distinct interests, rendering a compromise extremely difficult to find, if not if possible. The first grouping I've already mentioned, that is the V4, the Visegrad 4. They vehemently oppose mandatory relocation, and that was and is, of course, the single most important stumbling block, but it's not the only one. The Visegrad 4 are often supported by Austria these days and also Denmark, although Denmark doesn't have a right to vote on the proposals as a result of its opt-out. A second grouping is now called the Med5. They even call themselves the Med5 themselves, the Mediterranean 5. That is the frontline member states Greece, Italy, Spain, also Cyprus and Malta. They insist on mandatory solidarity, and they are highly critical of the border procedure and the screening regulation because they suspect the border procedure might end up in huge camps at the external border, leaving the frontline member states bearing most of the responsibility. And I've heard from within some institutions, or from within the institutions, that they are at the moment the most critical member states when it comes to discussions. The third grouping you might call the central or northern 5 to 8, depending on how you count. That I wouldn't have called a grouping until only 2 or 3 weeks ago, when Germany, France, the Benelux country, together with Switzerland, sent a letter to Greece complaining about what? About secondary movement and the perceived complicity of the Greek government in onward movements both by asylum seekers and beneficiaries of international protection. And that development is, so the central and northern 5 to 8 are the main asylum destination countries where people eventually end up staying in the long run. You may also include Sweden and the associated countries, Switzerland and Norway, in that list if you wish. They are, as I said, concerned with secondary movements. Secondary movements are much less visible than boat arrivals in the Mediterranean. They gather much less media attention, but coming from one of these states, I can tell you that they very much occupy the minds of at least some decision takers in Berlin and also the other capitals. Why? Because statistics show us that the number of secondary movements is actually higher than the number of boat arrivals, especially in Italy at this juncture. And these central or northern 5 to 8 are increasingly getting combative in their political approach as well. You may have read in the newspaper not only about this letter sent to the Greek government, you may also have read that Germany and France in particular refused to revive the Malta Declaration, in which they had agreed to voluntarily take a certain share of boat arrivals in Italy. So it's really getting a quite competitive political situation, which may be a problem in itself if the Council breaks down into different groupings openly pursuing divergent interests. And finally, we have a group which is usually forgotten. It's the rest, and that rest is about 10 member states, so roughly 1/3 of the members of the Council. And they are usually ignored. Why? Because they don't make it into the headline news. Why? And why don't they make it? Because they receive comparatively few people. Few people land there and few people go there in the long run. And they shouldn't be forgotten, however. Why? Because the rest, is not too unhappy with the legal status quo. Like it or not, most governments prefer not to have too many asylum seekers or refugees at the moment. So the rest, who doesn't receive them empirically at the moment, is actually not unhappy with the status quo. They might certainly be willing to compromise, but questions like mandatory relocation is something which are very sensitive to these countries as well, because they would mean in practice that they receive more people. And I've been told before by people involved in the negotiations that some of these countries also hide between the Visegrad Four, at least in the public debate. So in a nutshell, on my first observations, political negotiations are complicated behind profound asymmetries of interest between the member states. We are not negotiating between the metaphorical wheel of ignorance. Member states know exactly, and they make calculations. What do the proposals mean for us? And like it or not, many member states will prefer to have less people, even if many of them, including the German government, are of course willing to assume their share. But usually what they perceive to be their fair share is not as much as would be required. That's the first observation. The second one, I've given the heading Interdependency, a snapshot on solidarity. Solidarity and relocation are undoubtedly the most important stumbling block for the political negotiations, although it would probably be wrong to say that everything would be easy if only that Gordian knot was open and broken up. That would be wrong. Why? Note that the majority of third country nationals arriving in Spain at the moment come from Western Africa and also Morocco. The situation is similar for Italy, although there are also different countries of origins arriving in Italy. And that is relevant for the policy debate because the statistical chance of these people of getting a positive asylum decision is statistically quite small. So for these people, solidarity or mandatory relocation would probably not be considered politically. Not even the relocation decisions adopted in September 2015, which concerned the relocation of more than 100,000 asylum seekers from Greece and Italy to the other member states, mandatory solidarity, included these people. They were limited to people with a statistical chance of being recognized of above 75% for the European Union as a whole. So if we talk about the political package as a whole, solidarity is a crucial issue, but this group has to be addressed as well. So like it or not, and many among this group will usually not like it, or at least many academics will not like it, but member states will want to find a solution for people with comparatively low chances of being recognized as a beneficiary of protection as well. And that means, in practical terms, questions like border procedures are politically speaking, a sort of obligatory element of the whole pact, even if the solidarity conundrum was resolved. So that is the independency to start with. From a purely legal perspective, the reform package could be adopted by a qualified majority vote in the Council. Subject, of course, to the consent of the European Parliament, which has to agree as well. And by means of a qualified majority vote, we could possibly even find a solution to the solidarity mechanism. Although it's far from clear whether there would be enough member states to support a qualified majority, considering that the rest is quite uncertain about what they want in practice. Nevertheless, it seems to me that it is a question of political wisdom not to force a qualified majority vote and thereby forcing a constitutional conflict which would occur if some member states openly rejected complying with the asylum package. You all know what happened to Hungary and some other member states who had vetoed the 2015 relocation decisions. They were brought to court. The court delivered a judgment saying they have violated EU law, but then nothing happened because also the decisions didn't apply anymore, ratione temporis, so there was nothing to implement anymore. But with the new package, the situation would be different. You would receive a court judgment saying Hungary, for instance, is obliged to take a certain number of people, and they would quite simply refuse to do so. And what do you do next? I mean, you can try to cut budget subsidies or the like, but that's a constitutional conflict which the European Union, maybe for very good and wise reasons, does not want to risk. Why? Because it's a conflict which it could possibly even lose. At the end of the day, we might realize we do not have the political legitimacy and clout to really force member states to participate against their will. And acceptance of these limitations, first by the commissions when presenting the proposals, and then also by the council trying to take most member states on board, at least on the basic contours of the pact, is, as I would say, probably politically wise, and it's also the main reasons why the pact is a classic case of what you might call realpolitik. It's not a beautiful proposal by the Commission. It's not really based on a grand vision or abstract ideas or principles, something the Commission has usually tried to put forward when it presents a new policy idea. It's a rather pragmatic instrument trying to do as much as is possible given the political circumstances. And that is why I personally can understand why the Council also tries to work with all member states. Be it as it may, you can have a different opinion, of course, and I'm curious what we will hear later. If we start from the assumption that mandatory relocation will not happen on a massive scale for very many people, this has knock-on effects for what the Commission could propose and what the Council and the Parliament will be able to agree on at the end. Why? If you cannot rely on relocating thousands or tens of thousands of people, the political consequence is that you must deal with the people at the external border, or at least in the frontline member states. Because if you cannot relocate them, you must deal with them in the frontline member states, or at the external border. So the absence of mandatory solidarity automatically meant that the external border had to take center stage in the proposals. And that is precisely what the Commission did. You will hear throughout the course the summer school about the screening regulation, and then mainly also about the border procedure and the ensuing return procedure for those who get a negative decision. That was a somehow automatic consequence of the absence of mandatory relocation. In practical terms, this also meant that the infamous first entry rule was bound to stay. If you cannot relocate people, which state has to assume responsibility under the successor instrument for the Dublin regulation? Well, the member states where people enter irregularly, in the absence of some other criteria which might apply as legal specialis. And that is what happened in the Pact. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen proclaimed in her State of the Union address to the European Parliament in September last year that Dublin is dead. Similarly, the Commission press material accompanying the Pact said it's a fresh start. And they also stated quite bluntly, the current system no longer works. And at a very technical and formal level, that was an adequate description. Dublin is dead. The Commission proposes to abolish the Dublin III regulation, and it also repeals the proposal for the Dublin IV regulation, which it had put forward in 2016. They are replaced by new instruments, screening regulation, asylum and migration management regulation, and a force majeure regulation. But that's only the formal, technical side of it. The substance remains very much intact. The idea of Dublin being dead, of a fresh start, is very much a public relations stunt. Once you take away the wrapping paper, surprise, Dublin reappears. the first entry criterion remains intact. It's altered to some extent, but the essence remains intact. That applies not only to the first entry criterion. There is a flip side to the first entry criterion, which is often ignored in the academic and the political debate, although it is practically very important. And that's the transfer of jurisdiction in case of secondary movement. If an asylum seeker moves to a second member state, after being registered in a first member state, they do get at present a second asylum procedure in this second member state. And this second member state can send this person back under Dublin rules or the successor rules, but if the take back fails in practice, as it usually does, statistically 70, 80, 90% of all take-back requests fail in practice, they are not implemented, then the second member state has to assume responsibility. So the asylum seeker gets a full and regular asylum procedure in the second member state. So secondary movements are technically illegal, but if you engage in them, you nonetheless get a second procedure once the return has failed. And that is highly relevant, at least for the northern or central 5 to 8 member states. And negotiations within the Council on the Dublin IV regulation had moved in a direction to abolish that transfer of jurisdiction, at least for a couple of years. And it's now back in the Pact. But that again was an automatic knock-on effect. Once you keep the first entry criterion, you also had to keep the transfer of jurisdiction, and it's kept at least for asylum seekers. It's abolished for beneficiaries of international protections. And recent events showed that this continuation of the status quo under the disguise of new instruments can politically be toxic. I've mentioned the letter sent by the central or northern 5 to 8 to Greece. And I've also mentioned that the Met 5 are probably the ones who are politically the most opposed to the proposal within the Council. That's at least what I've heard. And that's, of course, understandable from a rational choice perspective. All these member states defend what they perceive to be their national interest. But it's highly toxic for, of course, political negotiation. And in a way, it's even tragic. Why? Because we have the two groupings, which actually are the factual columns on which the European asylum system rests. Frontline member states and northern states confronting each other, and all the others, Visegrad 4 and the rest, they stand at the margins, and the main countries now fight each other. And I'm a notorious optimist, so maybe a good fight can be the basis for sitting down together and finding a compromise, but when it comes to asylum, I get less and less optimistic when it comes to the political negotiations. Thirdly, and I'm getting shorter towards the end of my presentation, shorter in the comments on the different points, the law is not enough. A major problem of EU asylum law are discrepancies between what you might call the law in the books, so the law in the official journal, and asylum practices on the ground. You all know living conditions on the Greek islands, they are insufficient. They are often in violation of secondary legislation, maybe not of human rights, but at least of secondary legislation. But it's not only living conditions which are insufficient, as the infamous Moria camp showed to the world. It's also asylum procedures which are ineffective. Asylum seekers have quite some procedural guarantees and rights on paper, but they often do not exist in practice, as you will probably hear later this afternoon in the second panel. But it's not only the rights of asylum seekers which are lost when the law is being applied in practice. For the political negotiations, another element is crucial. The flagrant compliance and implementation deficits also concerns asylum procedure in terms of efficiency. The Commission proposes in the Pact that the asylum procedure, including legal remedy, in a border procedure is to last a maximum of 20 weeks, including legal remedies, and 12 weeks in situations of crisis. And then there is another 12 to 20 weeks for the return procedure to be realized. That sounds attractive, reasonably attractive, or maybe not, but that sounds at least as a start to negotiate. It would add up to 6 months for the procedure and the return in cases of crisis. The problem is that member states do not trust these legislative proposals anymore, because Article 31 Asylum Procedures Directive already says at present that the procedure is to be completed within 6 months, at least for the administrative decision. That is not a reality in quite some member states. And that is to be accelerated, including legal remedies. And the same applies to return. I mean, it sounds good, at least to member states, to say that the return is to be implemented within 6 months at most, but member states thus don't trust these legal proposals anymore, because they have learned throughout the past years that it is apparently impossible to implement such rules in the European periphery, on the Greek islands or elsewhere. And that is the main reasons why probably the MAT5 are so critical of the proposals, because they fear that at the end of the day, there would be these huge camps developing, like many big Morias throughout the Union. The procedures, even if they are effective, do not result in relocation, and they do not result in returns. So the people end up in frontline member states. But it's not only the MAT5 which are unhappy. It's also the Visegrad 4 which are unhappy. You will probably have heard about the return sponsorship, which is, of course, a quite cynical description in a way. And the Visegrad 4 would probably call it a quite cynical description as well. Why? They are supposed to sponsor the return for which the frontline member state assumes the administrative responsibility. And in case the return doesn't take place, which it usually doesn't, they are supposed to relocate these people to Hungary or elsewhere. So return sponsorship could, in practice, given the flagrant compliance deficit, also in the field of return, mean relocation in disguise. So no one is happy, and that really complicates the negotiations very much, because we are somehow negotiating at 2 levels. And we are not only trying to connect on the legislative level these different policy elements, which are all interconnected. Member states then also ask themselves, what does that mean in practice? And they know that quite often in EU asylum law, especially the situation at the external border, is not as the law in the book says. So I assume that is one of the big reasons which is very challenging. Even if they agree to find a compromise politically, member states might not be willing to sign up, because they just don't trust that compromise to be effective in practice anymore. So what can the EU institutions do to improve the situation, to improve compliance? There are 2 elements to watch, at least, because they have a certain leverage, the EU institution. The first is money. One crucial component of the overall negotiations has been concluded successfully, and that's an agreement on the multi-annual financial framework for the 2021 to 27 period. That's the EU's 6-year overall budget. The Justice and Home Affairs budget will increase quite considerably. Much of the money will go to the agencies, but quite some money is earmarked for member states as well. And the money earmarked for member states can be used much more flexibly than under previous multi-annual financial frameworks. And that gives the EU institutions some leverage to use that money to improve the situation on the ground. And the second element is the agencies. Frontex has a very strong mandate already, adopted in 2019, which is currently being implemented. And that implementation turns out to be quite complex and challenging from an administrative and managerial point of view, which is a problem in itself. So they also have a compliance deficit, or at least because they get a lot of money and new powers, and they now have to render these powers effective, which is quite difficult. And we will hear later that the new EEA proposal, EUAA, EU Asylum Agency proposal, will probably be adopted as well. thereby also bringing the legislation in line with what the agency does already, because on the ground, as Lilian Surdi has shown in her excellent research, the agency is doing quite a lot of what it will be officially authorized to do already. So all that is essential, the money and the agencies, but I think we shouldn't ignore that they are only support instruments. The brunt of the administrative responsibility will rest with the member states. If you compare the Justice and Home Affairs budget of the European Union, you realize that it's quite small compared to the annual budget of the German Federal Asylum Office and the German Federal Police, who essentially does border police and asylum issues within Germany. And that's only like one comparator. So the EU budget and the agencies are important, but member states will also in future be those who are responsibly, politically, financially, and also legally for the overall majority of the decisions on the ground. So Frontex, EASO are very visible politically. They're also very, very important. I don't want to minimize their relevance, but do not ignore that member states bear a lot of responsibility as well. Externalization, I have to hurry up, no? I do, yes, okay. Externalization via third states. I think I can be quite quick on it because there is not actually too much to say. Why? The Commission communication accompanying the proposals contained quite a lot of strong language on cooperation with third states, but it added comparatively little substance. But that is not something we should criticize the Commission for, but it was somehow natural. Why? The Pact is an internal document, but if you want to cooperate with third states, you have to negotiate with these third states, of course, and that cannot be ordered by means of internal legislation or an internal communication. It's just a matter of really conducting these negotiations, and these negotiations are ongoing. They have been ongoing for quite some years, and they are actually quite successful. I'll spare you the detail. I'll just give you two very, very short examples. The first example, I will just mention terms like EU-Turkey statement and cooperation with Libya. I mean, the number of arrivals in Greece and Italy is comparatively small compared to some years ago. That has to do with the pandemic, but it certainly has to do with cooperation with Turkey and Libya as well. And you may have read in the news that the European Council last Friday or Thursday, I think it was the dinner of Thursday, agreed to negotiate a new pact or statement with Turkey. And the second example I want to mention is Morocco. You will remember May this year when Morocco stopped controlling the border to Ceuta, and suddenly the Spanish authority or successive Spanish governments of different political orientation had erected over the past years and erected in ever higher, didn't stop people arriving in Ceuta anymore. So and this I think showed you as a very empirical example that all these border forces and Frontex, border fences or Frontex will in themselves never stop the migrants. They are effective if third states cooperate as well. And once Morocco stopped cooperating, people arrived. And that shows you by way of as a negative example, and I mean that purely analytical, how effective cooperation with Spain and Morocco is usually. Because usually these people don't make it to the border. Why? Because the Moroccans prevent them from going there. So cooperation with third states is the huge theme. It has little to do with the pact itself. It's ongoing, and the European Council last Friday pressed on the Commission to move ahead. I will just very briefly mention three very short examples which have to do with the pact. The first is what in German is called the visa leverage. I don't actually know whether it's called that way in Brussels. It is apparently. So that's Article 25A of the Visa Code regulation, which is currently being put in practice. They want to render visa applications more difficult for people coming from certain third states, That means third states who do not cooperate in return. And the underlying idea is you really address the political, social, and economic elite of these countries, because it's those people who apply for Schengen visas in the first place. And there are some confidential Commission reports which you can find online if you have a very basic idea how to find these documents. I can tell you tomorrow in my lecture how to find them. And I've read in the German media today that apparently Eritrea, Somalia, Bangladesh, and Iraq are earmarked to be the first sort of trial partners for the visa leverage. The second one is budget. I will just mention the NDC, the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument. There is a 10% target for migration-related project. Maybe we can hear more about it later from the Council. The European Council last Friday or Thursday called up on the institutions to really use that 10% target. And the third example is talent partnership. That was supposed to be legal pathways for economic purposes, and I consciously used the past tense. The Commission proposals or the Commission ideas were tabled a few weeks ago, but it's not actually a proposal or a communication. It's just a list of documents, and they are, as expected, I might add, quite meager, and in a way that's quite representative also for cooperation with third states. This idea of really having migration-related projects in there, including legal pathways, is usually, it gains much political attention, but it's usually not being implemented much in practice. And by way of conclusion, just very, very briefly, one last idea. It's sometimes said, especially by those who are skeptical or critical of the Pact, that maybe it wouldn't be too bad if we continue with the status quo. And I mean, from a purely legal perspective, they are, of course, correct from their point of view. If the new Pact isn't adopted, then the old legislation remains in place. And if some NGOs in particular prefer the old legislation to the new one, I mean, that's technically correct. And that legislation would certainly also be applied in many European countries. But at the external border, the signs are different. Member states seem increasingly willing not so much to violate the law. I mean, some do, like Hungary, they openly violate the law. Other member states use legal gray zones, like Spain. I mean, you may discuss the ECHR judgment on Ceuta and what it means. You may discuss whether there are higher standards under EU asylum legislation. But then again, it's uncertain whether these people apply for asylum. So I'll spare you all the details. There are many legal gray zones. And legal gray zones mean that often there will be violations, but also sometimes there will not be a violation. And these legal gray zones, which exist, there are legal gray areas where we do not know exactly what the law requires. They can serve as a sort of camouflage, which in academic writing is called legal formalism, or also legal black holes, where member states actively use these legal gray zones to promote more restrictive tendencies. And I think that is what we can observe at the external borders at the moment. I'm not saying that everything is necessarily illegal. Some instances are illegal, some are not. But member states use that. So the alternative to the status quo is not so much continuation of the status quo, but it's a slippery slope away from the legal obligations that we have. I mean, remember what happened in Greece in March last year, when Greece simply closed its border, and Commission President von der Leyen praised Greece as the shield of Europe. I mean, you can discuss what exactly the Asylum Procedures Directive requires in such a situation. It's not crystal clear, but there are some tendencies, or think of the pushback allegations and all that. You can discuss the legal dimension. It's actually very complex, but member states use these gray zones. So especially when it comes to the external borders, the alternative is not so much strict appliance of the status quo. It's a slippery slope towards externalization and the gradual decline of the rule of law, if you want that. That's the alternative. And if you want a European Union which has a functioning asylum policy based on guarantees which ideally are also applied in practice, I think there is no alternative to a new legal framework. The debate is politically highly challenging, and I do not envy those in Brussels who are involved with them, but I personally wish them good luck because the alternative is not good, and I wish you good luck with the summer school because it's extremely difficult and tricky, and trying to find your way through the jungle is what the summer school can ideally do. Thanks.
Thanks, dear Daniel. Well, I knew that you are an insider in German politics, but I discovered that also you seem to be an insider in EU politics, with what's happening in the institutions and in Brussels. Just also to say that we are going to publish tomorrow morning on our blog a post from you about this idea of legal gray areas. This being said, I disappear and I leave the chair to Jean-Louis de Brouwer.
Thank you very much, Philippe. I'm very happy to be with you this afternoon. I feel a little bit like a permanent furniture of this Odysseus Summer School, which, by the way, offers me the possibility to be upgraded because I used to be a panelist and I was a moderator, and this time I'm both a panelist and a moderator. So you see there is a future. Okay, you were obviously hinting in the final part of your intervention, Daniel, to those involved in the negotiation. This guy is involved in the negotiation, at least he's followed them from very closely. And having heard Raoul time and again, I always learn a lot listening to him about, okay, what is cooking inside the Justice Lipsius, waiting for maybe the European Parliament to chip in at a later stage, as it was stated by you and Philippe. So Raoul, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Don't really know where to start, to be honest. Well, Daniel, thanks for the opening lecture. You've made my task both very, very difficult and easy. Difficult in the sense that indeed your account was very, very detailed and more importantly, absolutely accurate. And I think also your description of the situation absolutely accurate. So I'll build on basically what you said, but maybe add a few more details and a bit more information. I'll try to be as open as I can as an official from the Council General Secretariat. Before I go into different elements, and I will go through the member states' positions again, the elements of realpolitik, also touch upon the link with Schengen, and say a few words about what is going on and what we might expect to happen, and maybe finish with a few words on the European Council this week. Just before I go into member states' positions, because as was just said, member states look at this through the eyes of their national interest. And their national interest, I think for more or less all of them, except maybe one, is either having less or not getting more of migration. That means they look at the data, and they look at the data of the situation where they come from, and what would a situation or a proposal as is on the table in terms of distribution mean for them. Now, if I look at the data, aggregated data of the last 5 years, 2015 to 2020, on first-time asylum applications. First, I have to make a huge caveat because this is Eurostat data that only tells us so much. There's double counting in there, there are other flaws in there, and so on and so forth. But it's the best we have. And if you look at that data and you look at it per capita, which is the interesting parameter, you see that the first member state by far is Cyprus. Second is Malta. Third is Greece. Fourth is Sweden. Then comes Hungary, but that's because of an anomaly, I should say, resulting from 2015, where actually the million passing through Hungary was counted. but definitely didn't stay in Hungary. Then you have Luxembourg, then you have Austria, then you have Belgium. I stop here, pause here, because that is the moment where you hit the EU average. So those are the member states that per capita gain more, or have more influx, have more asylum applications than would be the EU average. Below that, you have a number of member states going from Finland, France, Netherlands, Italy, Bulgaria, Spain, Denmark, Slovakia, Ireland, Croatia, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Czech Republic, Portugal, Estonia, Slovakia. Now there's a number of there that are not very surprising. It's Central Eastern Europe, the Baltics, and so on, where we know that the asylum seeker numbers are very, very low. But you have below the EU average Spain and Italy. Now that is one of the most important determining factor of the negotiating dynamics. Now if I look at those numbers, because per capita is one criteria to look at them, but if you look at per capita and then look at the absolute figures, you get an interesting picture because it shows you the systemics of the system, and looking this time at first-time asylum decisions, which also shows you a bit what a member state's asylum system is actually working at. And what we try to do in looking at those numbers is we took a zero line, which is if every member state would have its fair share according to population. So if asylum decisions would have been taken according to per capita in the entire union, everybody would be at zero. Okay? Now, over the last years, 2015, 2020, Germany took 1 million decisions more than it should have if asylum decisions would have been taken, distributed fairly among member states. That's number one. Then we have a quick drop to Sweden, where you're at 180,000, then comes Austria, then Greece, then Belgium, then Cyprus, then Malta, then Luxembourg. If I look at it from the bottom up, the one who has taken less decisions than it would have if asylum decisions would have been taken sort of according to a fair share to population, is Poland. Because Poland is rather numerous in terms of population. That is 340,000 decisions less taken by Portugal than it would have taken if all those asylum applications would have been taken according to a fair share, according to population. Then we have Spain with 217,000, then Romania, big population as well, and then Italy with 98,000, and all the others in between. Now, this is the situation member states go into the room. So they know exactly where the flows go, what would be the situation for them, and what could be the result if you would have a system fully based, which it is not, but if it would be fully based on mandatory relocation, on distribution according to a fair share. And by the way, if your distribution key is per capita or per capita and GDP and so on, there is a bit of fluctuation, but not much. Now, this explains very much member states' position. So let me build a bit on what Daniel said. You have this group of 5 to 8, which is the European West, North. So that's basically Germany, the Benelux, Sweden, and to some degree France. They see themselves as those who would benefit from the Pact, very clearly. There would be more distribution throughout Europe. There would be more responsibility in the south, more border procedures, screening regulation, and so on. So basically less secondary movements, less for them. For some as well, I think, which is the case especially for Germany, also having more predictability in terms of search and rescue would help in some parts of the public debate, where I think there is a strong part of civil society, the churches, NGOs, which can be very critical of the government in this regard, which is much less the case in other member states, where such news hardly makes headlines. You have the V4, yes, but I would say the V4 plus, because indeed you have Hungary and Poland, which are very vocal, have been very vocal in the past. They went to court, etc. So here you have a very clear line, but there are many others which are basically following the same. You have Croatia in there, you have Slovenia in there, Bulgaria, Romania to a certain extent, which are very much hiding behind them. You also have, I think, some of the Baltics, which are not too keen on any of this relocation issues. Getting through national parliaments with mandatory relocation is for them a very, very difficult stance. But they generally try to be good Europeans, and if it doesn't cost them too much politically, I think they would show openness. There is the Med5. They act as a bloc. That's correct, although their interests are completely different, which is one of the surprising elements in the negotiation. As the numbers very clearly show, you first have the two islands, Cyprus and Malta, which have a geographical position which makes them, I'd say, extremely exposed, vulnerable. Their burden is huge. Cyprus' burden currently is absolutely huge. So would they benefit from the pact? Yes. They would, I think, benefit even more than some of the countries of final destination. But nevertheless, they seem to think that they have very little other allies in the negotiation. So they stick with the other Mediterraneans, and especially with Italy and Greece. You also have, with Italy and Spain, sorry. You also have Greece, of course, which I think would also be one of the big beneficiaries of the pact if it would be adopted as proposed. But again, here they decide to stick together. Now the two difficult ones are indeed Italy and Spain. And I think this is actually where currently most of the pressure in the negotiations is. It's on Italy, it's on Spain. One could say most of the frustration is. Because they're not willing to move on this. And I think the assumption is that Italy and Spain are happy with the status quo. As the numbers quite clearly show, and if you look at the Dublin figures, it just reinforces the picture. Yes, they are countries of first arrival, but per capita, the pressure on them in terms of first arrival, frankly, is not big. Yes, it's a political issue, more in Italy than in Spain, by the way, because of the headline each search and rescue ship does, because of the political debate, the party political situation, and so on. But in terms of the burden on the Italian system, that is not so big. I think the reflection is also that moving from a system as currently, where you have de facto relocation through secondary movement on a very high scale, to a system of bureaucratically managed relocation, you could have the thought that, will we actually make it? As was explained in the first intervention, we have, I think, a difficult track record when it comes to implementation, which is called the law is not enough. So I think there is an assumption in Italy and Spain that applying the pact as proposed in practice will never work. One, because it would result in probably big centers in those countries. But secondly, the administrative capacity needed to actually make this work is probably not going to happen. At least that's, I think, the thinking of those two member states. Hence, they don't really see an interest in moving ahead. Now, there are a few odd ones in here as well. You have Austria, which should actually side with countries like the Benelux or Germany, but has taken, I think, a very political, I would say, ideological line of siding with the V4. And you have some oddities like Denmark, who through, I think, a very restrictive policy over the last years, managed de facto to decouple itself from member states to which it has been much closer some 10 years or so ago. So an element on the realpolitik here. If you want to play with this, there is an app available in any app store, which is the voting calculator of the council. So there you can play with it. You can also, it's very refined. So you can exclude Denmark or Ireland, depending on the proposals, and so on and so forth. And you can try and find your own majorities. Now, even if one were to go ahead with sort of the pact as it stands, or one where the relocation element is very prominent, so basically your assumption is that you would outvote most of Central and Eastern Europe. Is that possible? Yes, it is, but under one condition, that you of course have those in favor, that goes without saying, but you need the vote of at least Italy or Spain. Otherwise, it will not happen. Now, the fact that neither of the two have signaled that they could side with the Western, Northern member states, but rather for the moment siding with the blocking ones, so rather siding with the Central and Eastern European ones, just makes that there is absolutely no negotiating dynamic really emerging. One point I certainly agree is that it would be foolish for any presidency to actually trigger a qualified majority vote on such lines. One, politically, for any presidency, it would be very unwise. Secondly, on the more systemic element here, I certainly join the first speaker. I think it risks triggering a constitutional issue in the long run that is more harmful than anything else. So the situation is not very good in terms of the negotiating dynamics. When the Commission designed the pact, I think they were perfectly aware of this. That's also why there are certain elements in the pact which were, I think, specifically designed to get Spain and Italy on board. I think about one element in particular, which is search and rescue, which is relocation after search and rescue, which I think if you would ask around the Council's table, I don't think you would find any member states other than Italy, Malta, maybe Cyprus, maybe Spain, already there, I'm far less sure, that would be in favor of that. Because you might be in favor of relocation in a more systemic element, but certainly automatic relocation after search and rescue is, I think, the last thing member states would like to subscribe to. And even with such a controversial goodie in the proposal, Italy has not come on board in the negotiations. Let me say a word now about the Pact and Schengen. Because for some of this, to understand also why we are where we are in the negotiations, I think you need to return to the origins of some of what we're talking about. Because asylum and migration law in the European Union and the Pact are in quite some discussions seen as an isolated policy element, whereas they're not. If you look at why we have actually this acquis in the European Union, you go back to to the origins of the Schengen area. When Schengen was created as an area without internal border controls, you had to have a long list of so-called compensatory measures. If you look at the convention applying the Schengen Agreement, there is half an article which is about the lifting of border controls at the internal borders, and there is, I think, roughly 190 about compensatory measures. Some of those compensatory measures are in the area of asylum and migration, and they are specifically in the area of responsibility for handling an asylum application. So basically, the first Dublin rules were in the Schengen Convention. And among those rules, the rule of the responsibility of the country of first entry. Because already back then, the reasoning was, well, if we lift the controls at the internal border, that means the member states that have the external border will be responsible for anyone who enters the common area. Hence, to make sure that they do their job, they need to be responsible for everybody they let in. Hence, the responsibility and the first country of first entry rule. Now, why did member states like Italy, like Greece, like Spain, subscribe to such a rule in 1990, or the years just after? Whereas they, to be simple, hate that rule so much nowadays. Did they not know what they were doing? They perfectly knew what they were doing. Of course, the numbers were different at the time, but also the assumption was that there is more to gain from subscribing to this than not subscribing to this, because what they gained was access to the Schengen area. So the discussion you had back then, the decision member states needed to face, the national interest they were looking at was, do I stay out of the borderless Schengen area, or do I join? I will have to assume some obligations, and what later has become Dublin being one of them, but I will gain access to the Schengen area, my economy will gain access to the Schengen area, etc. Look at the geography. Spain, what, 2 big highways going north for exports. Italy, 5 entry points max, so on. So having internal border controls for some of those member states would be a huge problem nowadays. So it is very much linked, and it is linked again in the political thinking, and it is linked in the minds of the politicians, and it is linked in the minds of the negotiators. The Commission has treaded very, very carefully in its recent Schengen communication in not making too much of a link with the Pact, because it knows how difficult it is. But to show you how very clearly this is linked, when the Commission proposed its reform of the Schengen Border Code, so 2016, I think, those negotiations didn't go very far, because in 2019, I think it was, in a Coreper session, those member states that are now the ones in favor of the Pact told the others very clearly and very bluntly, listen, you don't want to move ahead on relocation, you don't want to move ahead on doing something against secondary movements, well, we will not move ahead in changing the rules of the Schengen Border Code. And those are the member states that since more or less 2015 still keep internal border controls in place. So that is very, very much linked, and you cannot really distinguishing the two. What it tells us more is that we currently don't have in the negotiation this element of this positive element that was there when Schengen was put in place. You have half the member states which don't see what they can gain from the Pact, a third that does, a lot in between, and there's no real incentive. which makes those decisions very, very, very difficult. If you take then I think you said 10 member states that according to your count were sort of the rest, what's in for them? What can we offer them? Why would they subscribe to this? This is so very difficult because there is nothing obvious that you can tell. You know, for Germany, it's very obvious. Germany is basically supporting the entire system currently. When you look at the numbers, that's very clear. It's very clear what's in here for Germany. What's in here for Estonia, for Latvia? Not very clear. Other than being very generous and very forthcoming and so on and so forth, and good Europeans. But in terms of their national interest, they don't really see what's in them for them. Now, I would add to this a few elements which are, I think, also to be looked at. Some were mentioned already, which explain also why this is taking a lot of time beyond the politics. It's the sheer complexity. Everything is in everything. Everything is linked to everything. The number of texts, number of proposals, the number of negotiators involved, the coordination this means in national administration, just the amount of time, of meeting time you need to go through them. Don't forget, we're negotiating at 27. If we were negotiating physically, well, which we haven't for a year and a half, which hasn't made things easier. If we do so, even physically, a lot of that has to go through to interpretation and so on. So just the complexity of the negotiation makes this very, very, very difficult. An additional complexity was added beginning of this year by our own legal service, who issued an opinion on the Pact, by which it basically disagreed on a number of points or number of legal choices that the Commission has done in its proposals. Those relate in particular to which elements of the different proposals relate to the Schengen acquis or the Dublin acquis, which affects the right of participation of the member states. And our legal service is of the opinion that what is on the table does not respect the Dublin and the Schengen acquis, and some of the proposals should be put differently, and some of these issues put forward are highly political. In particular, in the opinion of our legal service, the solidarity part of the successor instrument to Dublin should be seen as part of the Dublin acquis, which would make it applicable to those member states that apply the Dublin acquis, but what would have been out of it, according to the Commission, that is in particular Denmark and the four associates. So how can we move ahead? Difficult. I think there could be two options here. One is moving ahead, respecting the design of the Pact as it is on the table. So the fundamentals as put forward by the Commission, with, to use sort of the political terms used most, some more responsibility at the external borders, some solidarity, and see how far we can get. That is certainly what currently in the negotiations are about. Another option would be realizing that we will probably get neither, and that the status quo is the best we can get, and see how we can get an accepted status quo. and I stress the word accepted here, meaning that would mean that we accept large-scale secondary movements as being part of the design of the system. Now that is the thing that is politically not easy to accept, although it has been de facto accepted for the last 30 years. And I would add accept the status quo plus, sort of still trying to do the improvements that can be done, for the sake of just making the system better. And if you look at the agreement that hopefully is in the process of being found, we still have a trilogue ahead of us and need to go to Coreper this Wednesday on the European Asylum Agency, EASO. This is more or less what it looks like, because the compromise that is currently on the table is an improvement, very clearly. It's an improvement of the mandate of the agency. It allows to go forward. It's a confidence-building measure, but the agreement that was found brackets those provisions that were controversial for, in particular, the frontline, the first entry member states, meaning that all the rules on monitoring of asylum systems will not enter into force. And the enter into force of those elements, which will remain in the text, but the enter into force of those elements will be linked to the reform of Dublin. So it is, some say, there was a lot of talk about the package approach, and some say, oh, finally the package approach is broken, we go ahead, and so on. Well, yes, because indeed member states will probably agree, hopefully this week, to take forward this text. But politically, the package approach is there as much as it has always been, because we basically decided to ring fence those elements and link their entry into force to an eventual agreement or not on the rest of the pact. So is that a model for other parts of the pact? Maybe. Some certainly have the hope that it is, so that between reasonable people one can advance on the elements on which you agree, which would improve the system. But postpone to a later day, the more difficult issue that, at least for the moment, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. I think I've been too long. Maybe just 2 words about the European Council last week. Before we started, Jean-Louis asked me, what's going on? And I said, well, not much. So he said, no news, good news. I said, yes. Because the initial drive for that European Council is, well, we're not advancing on the pact, let's discuss the pact. Now, we managed, I think, successfully not to discuss the pact, which is good news. But instead, there is a paragraph about the external dimension. I think it's a rather balanced one, actually calling on the Commission and the NTAS to come forward with a number of elements. Also the financing and Indici was mentioned. Why I'm saying that not discussing the pact is actually good, given the situation we're in. Going to the level of the European Council, where decisions are taken by consensus, when no agreement is in sight, cannot bring anything good, other than reinforcing everybody's positions, going back into the trenches, and going maybe back to some European Council conclusions language that some find problematic, which is language talking about consensus on the reform of the asylum system, which is not what the treaties prescribe, of course, as voting rule, because the voting rule is QMV. Actually avoiding the European Council just having a fight on this without any result, at least to me, is good news, and don't quote me on this last part. Thank you very much.
Well, okay, now my 10 minutes of drama, because I'm split between my role of panelist and my role as moderator, and I definitely would like, before we break this session, and I already informed the colleagues dealing with the virtual audience, to take 2 sets of 3 questions, 3 coming from the physical audience and 3 coming from the virtual audience. So I invite colleagues following us from somewhere else in Europe or outside Europe to start preparing their questions, and then we'll break for the coffee or the cigarettes. I would like just to make 3 comments following these very, very, very rich presentation. One about the negotiation dynamics, one about the EC conclusions, and one about why a solution is needed anyway, whatever it takes. The negotiation dynamics. Okay, this is a typical EU transactional negotiation. I mean, there's absolutely nothing new under the sun. I mean, it's the rule of the game inside the council, whether it is about migration, what is about environment, what is about climate change, what is about, well, not trade is a bit different, I would say. It's always like that. Now we are in an EU area of the European history, the European integration history, where the first question asked by member states when they enter the negotiation room on any kind of subject is, what is in there for me? So there is absolutely nothing here which differentiates migration than any other EU policy areas for the time being. Second comment about the negotiation dynamics. Crisis or not crisis? I remember vividly that in the early days of the von der Leyen Commission, way before the beginning of the pandemic, people were of the view that now that the 2015-2016 refugee crisis, between inverted commas, was over, that people would be, I would say, somewhat more relaxed, between inverted commas, that the tension would basically be somewhat lowered down, and that therefore it would be possible to have an adult conversation about migration and migration-related issue at last. And that was guided the Commission in the preparation of its proposal and a very lengthy consultation process that was led by the Commission when preparing the Pact. Now, indeed, thanks to COVID, we do not have a huge migration pressure at the external border for the time being. So there is indeed no crisis. Does that help to deliver in terms of negotiation? No, of course, because there is absolutely no pressure on the member states. Why should I budge? I mean, people do not care about the migration pact for the time being. They care about their vaccines, they care about their holidays, they care about their jobs. For those in charge, they care about the implementation of the recovery plans, if not caring about the next election, whether it is in France or Germany. So there is no pressure. And again, I mean, the first question is, what is in there for me? And the second question is, why should I budge? And of course, my third comment about the negotiation dynamics would be about, it was said by both Daniel and Raoul, the technical complexity of the issue at stake. I mean, I was a bit worried when you started your presentation, Daniel, when you said you might not have heard about border procedure and all these kind of things. I will not expand on that. I thought that you were going to invite those who haven't heard about that to leave the room. But thanks God, I mean, you were kind enough to refer them to a document which is available in your team's file about it. It is indeed a very, very complex negotiation. And on the top of that, I mean, allow me to say that some of the solutions proposed by the Commission are, for me, simply incomprehensible. I mean, return sponsorship. Whoever invented return sponsorship? It was never tested anywhere. At least in the good old days when we were coming with new ideas, we could at least illustrate them by successful or not successful example elsewhere. For instance, I remember the battle that we had to fight to convince member states that maybe resettlement were a good idea. Okay, they were precedent about resettlement. Can someone in this room quote me a place where return sponsorship has ever been implemented? Also, what is more of a concern is how will the flexible solidarity be implemented? I mean, ask yourself the question if you understand what flexible solidarity can mean. Okay, relocation is the baseline. But okay, if you don't want to apply relocation, you have the choice between 2 other forms of solidarity, either return sponsorship or contribution to, I would say, operations of the agencies, increasing the amount. Okay, then my question is, okay, what is going the price tag for refusing the relocation of one asylum seeker? Okay, what is going to be the price tag? I mean, should it be dissuasive? I mean, does that mean that it should be high enough to make you think that I'll maybe still go for a relocation than do all that? All that is not there. All that is not there. So therefore, it's not only technically complex for all the reasons that was explained, but it is also, I mean, very vague, at least, what is on the menu and what is on the table on some of the absolutely key and fundamental issue. And of course, the connection with Schengen, when the new version of the Schengen Border Code will be proposed by the Commission sometimes in the autumn, will not make the life of the negotiators easier. Now, about the EC conclusion, the European Council conclusion, in other words. What struck me is that what they did not say. I tend to agree with you. But that at least one could have thought about conclusion which would have said, okay, you guys, the Pact has been with us for about 1 year now. It's time to deliver. We don't say in what way, but it's really time to deliver. And by the way, you showed that you were able to deliver. I mean, there was an agreement on the visa information system. There was an agreement on the financial envelope for the funds, implementing the solidarity. There is an agreement on the green card. There is an agreement on the making in European asylum system. So yes, you can do it, but now do it. And you can all the more do it then, okay, now indeed, and we should not underestimate what Raoul said, you can at last meet in person. So, I mean, no virtual meetings anymore. I mean, you are able to sit in the same room, to shout at each other, and to start actually negotiating. It will make your life much easier. They did not say that. They just, okay, it's the European Football Club Football Club for the time being, so I will use the expression in French. I don't know how to translate that in English. They did the usual trick. Ils ont botté en touche. They talk about the relation with third countries. Okay. So you don't deliver inside, but you will deliver outside. Let me quote, and I do that often, I mean, someone who knows a little bit about the EU external relation. It happens to be the High Representative Vice President of the Commission, Mr. Borrell, who says very widely, as long as the EU will not be a political entity, it will not deliver an external relation policy. That is exactly what is at stake. Why is the EU nowadays the biggest trade power in the world? Because we build the internal market, of course. Because we build the internal market. Why are we, for the time being, the leading negotiator on climate change? Because we seem to be in a position to put our house in order with regard to, targets and limits. So, it gives us clout. How do you think that we can enter into a negotiation with third countries about migration when they look at the shamble the EU internal migration can be for the time being? This will simply not fly. All the more than I agree with you that when you read the menu of what this partnership or negotiation could be, it's relatively comprehensive, it's relatively balanced, and I agree with you for one, but still. Okay, dealing with the root causes, fine. I was really struck by the list of 4 countries that you mentioned earlier concerning the possible victims of the visa leverage. I doubt about Bangladesh. I was a bit surprised because, Bangladesh is usually quoted as a kind of a model country in terms of accompanied return and implementing return of its citizens. But Iraq, sorry if I miss one of them, Eritrea, Somalia, and Iraq. All these countries, and for all my sins I've been for sometimes in charge of humanitarian aid inside the Commission, are victims of man-made disaster. What do we do to deal with the root causes? What do we do to help them to deal with these situations, which are indeed migrant-producing? Zero. Nothing. Last weekend, the King of Jordan and the President of Egypt were in Baghdad to discuss the situation in Iraq with the Iraqi government and to confirm their solidarity to the Iraqi government for whatever it takes. Where is the EU? Nowhere. Where is the EU? Nowhere. And what do? Oh, we might consider imposing visa obligation or restricting the visa regime on the elite of these countries. What a nonsense! What a nonsense! Look at the difficulty which is ours to enter into a dialogue with the African Union. Although we propose a renewed EU-Africa strategy one year and a half ago, we are still aiming at possibly convincing a summit with the African Union, which is now postponed until 2022. Why? Because African countries are simply not ready to listen to the kind of paternalistic approach that the EU has always imposed on them until now. So, and in that circumstances, we think that we could enter into a dialogue on migration with them. Well, let's first talk about vaccine solidarity, and then we'll see what comes next. Now, last but not least, why is a solution still needed? There is indeed the option that you hinted at, that you were absolutely right to say that, okay, the elephant will remain in the room, the so-called mini deals option. I mean, there are a series of, okay, you can slice the package. At least, I think, in my own modest view, it gives, and I come back to what I said earlier about what could have said the European Council conclusion, it gives a feeling that, okay, yes, we can. We are not completely stuck on anything, and we are able to deliver from time to time, and okay, there will be a price to pay. I mean, the compromise is by definition a compromise, that is to say, you cannot have your cake and eat it, and you have to leave something in the room. So, I mean, that would still be an option, but the elephant of the solidarity versus responsibility would still be in the room. But why do we need something? First, because I could not agree more with the worry that you expressed, Danielle, about, I quote you, the gradual decline of the rule of law. I mean, what is happening today at the border, land or sea border of the external union is simply not acceptable from a legal and human point of view. And we close our eyes. That is simply not possible. So we need a remedy to that situation. Second thing, okay, I mean, we might not be in a crisis situation nowadays, but the crisis is looming on the horizon. I mean, three angles. Okay, the first one is the classical climate change and its consequences in terms of population movement. The second one is about geopolitics. It's about geopolitics. Everybody is now focusing on, rightly by the way, on Libya. I wonder what will happen when Lebanon will collapse. I wonder what's going to happen when Lebanon will collapse. I mean, there was last week a very interesting paper for those of you who are not familiar with Belgium in the Economist. I mean, there was every 10 years they write something about Belgium, and they refer to Belgium as the most successful failed state. Lebanon might be such a successful failed state. Look at what's going to happen in Afghanistan, and look at what's happening in Afghanistan today with the announced withdrawal of the Americans and their ally. I mean, who will be surprised if all of a sudden, in 10, 12 months from now, we could see a rising number of people fleeing Afghanistan, landing in Pakistan, then Iran, then Turkey, and then, not to mention Sahel. And not to mention Sahel. Barkhane is going on. I mean, what's going to come next after Barkhane in Sahel? No one knows. Absolutely no one knows. And all these countries, including Burkina Faso, which was sometimes seen as, I mean, the dearest of all possible donors, are going down the drain. Look at the situation in Mali. So the crisis is at our doorsteps, and doorsteps in the globalized world of today are very close distance, does not mean anything. And of course, I mean, there are remaining the demographic and economic imbalances. I mean, COVID-19, most probably the death toll paid by Africa for COVID-19 will not be as dramatic as it was expected, and yet, il faut voir. But the economic consequences of the crisis on Africa will be absolutely dramatic. So, I mean, don't expect the migration pressure to go down. So we need a solution for that purpose also. And last but not least, I mean, you were right. I mean, Daniel, you said yourself, I mean, there is nothing like a vision in the Commission proposal. And a vision was not needed. And I think that the Commission took the right step in being very pragmatic and trying to find pragmatic solution to a problem which was there. But we need a vision. I mean, we are now mostful about the conference on the future of Europe. Fine. But okay, let us understand once and for all that migration is part of the future of Europe. Migration will shape the European society. They shape the European societies today. There are 128 nationalities present in the Brussels region today. So, I mean, we need this kind of common understanding of what we are going to do in the future, now or in the future, maybe the next generation on migration. And for that reason also, we need something. I mean, some people do say, I said that recently, that, okay, this migration pact leads us nowhere. Nowhere is not an option. We must end up somewhere. Okay, thank you very much. Let's take now the questions. Maybe 3 questions in the room and then 3 questions from the virtual audience. So please stand up and speak. No? Maybe in the virtual audience, do you have questions from the virtual audience? Not yet? Time for a coffee. I could understand that for you, but not from the virtual audience. Raoul.
I would love to agree with you, Jean-Louis. No, just two reactions, if I may. One as regards the European Council. Just to put to you as bluntly the situation as it is. Yes, of course, the European Council could at least have had a paragraph saying, get on with these negotiations. And I will not quote which member state actually asked for that, but there was at least one member state which, in the preparatory process and in the written comments, clearly put this forward. Tasked the Council to move this forward. Tasked the next presidencies to move this forward. What do you think was the next proposal that came? It was adding to that census by consensus. Hence, in the end, it's better not to have it in the text. So that's where we are. I would love that we would not be there, but that's where we are. So, and I think one needs to recognize that. On the external dimension, I would not necessarily disagree with Borrell. But I would say 2 things. One, and Daniel, you actually mentioned them, EU-Turkey statement, the Malta Declaration, not the one about relocation from 19, but the one from the Maltese presidency, the Malta Summit Declaration, and so on, Valletta and everything what was done after that. You can agree or disagree with that, that's a different question. But still everything that was done to build up the capacity of the Libyan Coast Guard and so on and so forth. Cooperation with Morocco, I would say even cooperation with Western Africa, the Atlantic coast, Senegal, Mauritania. A lot of that, if not all, was actually done by member states. And with the political cloud of the EU, with the financing of the EU, and in the eyes of the member states, all those corporations have produced results. Let me put it that way. They've brought the numbers down and they've produced results. So there is actually a huge support among member states for this, and not just because we can't agree on the internal dimension. There is a genuine support for these policies currently around the table, and hardly anybody that would disagree with it. But in terms of implementing it, it's very much true that it's not the EU that flies out that negotiates any of these deals. It's the member states, the most affected ones. The most affected member states in terms of Turkey was Germany, in terms of numbers. Yes, they all went through Greece and Hungary and so on, but in terms of end result, and it was Germany that went out there and negotiated it. In terms of Libya, we don't do anything in Libya without Italy. We don't do anything in Morocco or in Africa, in the Sahel, without Spain. So just that as comments, and putting it a bit into also the context and how it's seen around the member states table.
So, Raoul, so still turning back to the audience, physical or virtual? Any question, any comment?
From the virtual session, we have Carolina Pope that would like to pose a question, to ask a question. Carolina, could you please open the camera and take the floor? Okay. I have another written question that I can read for you. Is it possible to receive the consolidated data regarding the asylum applications per capita in different member states, associated states?
Raoul, for you.
Our source is Eurostat, so all the data is publicly available. You might have to work a bit to put it all together, but it's publicly available as Eurostat data.
Okay. Okay, nobody else?
So what a question in the virtual audience, is she connecting or not?
No, not any longer. I mean, she was waiting. Yeah.
Okay, so what about the room? 1, 2, 3, okay. There is a microphone there. Ah, okay, you start with, okay. Then we'll take 4. I mean, keep your hands raised, but that will take 4 and then we'll break. Anyway, I mean, the second session will be the follow-up of this one, so you can come back with your questions during the second session, and I think that most of us will stay in the room. So please.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for these very insightful and useful presentations, and also highlighting kind of ambiguity behind the pact, and not only the pact and what was before. The picture of the negotiation and ongoing and the states was very clear, but my question is about the role of Croatia, the last actually member state, and now really at the forefront on the Balkan route, when and now that the one of the accesses has been and is becoming more and more controversial there. So what's your idea about also the role and the increasing role of such a small country, but in a very relevant geographical and geopolitical position nowadays? Thank you.
Okay, I propose that we take the 4 questions all together and then we'll answer them afterwards. So, I mean, I saw a hand there, the lady with a green jacket. Yes, please.
It's only allowed to ask one question or more?
Yes, please, no, please, you are.
Okay. One is about cooperation. Thank you for the opportunity first. Morocco is keeping migrants, and it was raised in relation with cooperation. And is it considered as a positive thing or negative thing, just to know? And the other one is this return sponsorship. It kind of raised a lot of questions to who are these people? Is it voluntary? Where are they returning to? Are they returning to safety or to more danger? Is their consent involved? All these things, I don't know, it creates a lot of questions. The other one, and I kind of picked up a sense that, and when migration is raised and an EU discussion, the interest of the state is kind of a primary point. Has it been like migration is considered as a positive thing, or not like a scary and overburden? And I don't know, there are some theories and discussions also, migration as a positive contribution to economy, social and all, and you also state a very nice sentence, it will shape the future of Europe. So it's kind of a scary and negative. I just picked up that kind of sense. The humanistic, the natural phenomenon of human history. I don't know. Has it discussed that way? Thank you.
So there was a question there, and there was also a last one, at least for this session, in the middle of the room. So we'll take the question there, and then I see your hand, and you will be the last asking. But please, I mean, keep your powder dry for the next session also. Please.
It works? Ah, yes, okay. Mine is very, very, very fast. Just regarding, well, to Daniel, regarding when you talked about the Dublin transfers, that between 70, I think I understood that between 70 and 90 maybe fail, basically. I wanted to know if you could share with us the source, or if that data is available and where. And also if it is disaggregated in countries. Thank you. And thank you for your presentation and debate.
Thanks. Yes. So my question would be for Mr. UBERECKEN. So my question would be for Mr. UBERECKEN on the behalf of the Council. So thank you for your presentation and your insight in the dynamics of negotiation. But my question would be about the conclusion that you presented. So you said that you foresee two ways to move ahead. One would be to move forward with the pact as it is, proposed by the European Commission. And you said, and to go as far as we can. And the other one would be to accept the status quo. And I'm interested if you could develop what you mean by to go as far as we can. Because what is the position of the Council if there is like a predicted explosion of detention camps or like asylum procedures that would go, the unrealistic time frame for asylum procedure, detention of children, and all the critics that the pact has received. So is the Council ready to go as far as it has been foreseen? Thank you.
Okay, so we'll leave it like that with questions for this first session. And again, please don't hesitate to come back at the end or during the second session. Well, I propose that we start in the follow-up order of intervention. Daniel first, then Raoul, and if needed, I can take what I can conclude. Please.
No, thanks indeed. First for the question and second for listening. I realized I spoke much too long. 4 very short and precise points. Firstly, in response to the question by the lady with the green jacket, my personal approach in all my academic work is what I would call analytical. I try to understand what is happening. I'm not primarily pursuing a normative agenda, but and sometimes reality can be quite cruel, and especially if we talk about the external borders, many of us dislike of what is happening, but it's not really, it's my intention to just analyze what is happening, and then you can do, in whatever position you are, can use that for your purposes. Secondly, the example you mentioned, return sponsorship, and the example mentioned by your colleague just a second ago, she mentioned the term detention and the like. That's the kind of small print which is really very also complex and technical, where I advise you to also consult the material which you have in your Teams folder, all the blog posts, because the issue for detention, for instance, is also technically quite complex. For screening, it's left for the member states, and then it's something else for the asylum procedure, the border procedure, and again, different rules for return thereafter. And Cornelissa has written a good post on that. So that's an example of these technical issues which are terribly important and complex, which I think we do not have time to discuss here. Thirdly, very briefly on Dublin requests, I do have a certain number of statistics. I can send them to you via email. The numbers were very spontaneous. It also depends on what you count. I mean, usually you have take-back requests, for instance, by Germany to Italy, which are then accepted automatically because silence counts as consent. And then the number of actual implementations is between, I think, 10–15%. It changes between the years. It also depends on how many Dublin requests Germany actually does. Germany, for many years, didn't do Dublin requests. If you look at the numbers, it's quite simply unbelievable that Germany does only like 50,000 Dublin requests or so, 2016, as they did. So in many cases, they just didn't do it anymore because they realized it's a waste of time anyway. So failure, and it has been consistent over the years, back to the 1990s. Dublin never worked in practice. Fourthly, very briefly, external relations mentioned earlier. In a way, I personally agree with both. I'm personally very disappointed that at the more political front and foreign and security front, Europe is so inactive on Iraq, on Libya, although they do something on Libya at least, on Syria, Afghanistan. I mean, they are more or less absent. But on the migration front, I would actually subscribe to what Raoul said. They are quite active together with the member states, the EU, Brussels, and the member states. I wrote a big chapter for a big book for EUP forthcoming next year, and I was very much impressed how rather consistently member states have pressed the externalization agenda over the past 30 years, ever since Germany started cooperating with Central and Eastern Europe on that matter, in the early 90s. It's fairly consistent. And the deals which they do, sometimes more formal, sometimes less formal, they have different components, different give and take. Sometimes it's a bit of legal migration, sometimes it's more political pressure, sometimes it's financial aid, sometimes it's operational support. But they do work. And I think Ceuta was, as I mentioned, a perfect example. Once Morocco stopped holding these people back, they entered Ceuta. And of course, Spain could maybe adopt some operational policies which prevent that if they prepare. But people do not arrive in Ceuta partly because of the fence, but partly because of the Moroccan police preventing, and let's face it, Western Africans from reaching the border face in the first place to apply for asylum. Only people with an Arab background are allowed to reach the Spanish border crossing point where they can apply for asylum. So we have a right to apply for asylum at border crossing points in the Asylum Procedures Directive, but then we at the same time pay the Moroccans to prevent West Africans from using that right. You can call it hypocrite, but it has been going on for years. And the Spanish government, Social Democrat, by the way, continues this policy without stopping it. Cooperation with Libya was pursued. It was called, I think, the Minetti Decree. Also, social democratic ministers. It really doesn't. Policies change a little bit depending on who governs. If it is the center-right, Salvini, they close the port, big media propaganda. If it is the social democrats, they do it a bit more calmly behind the scenes, but they do it as well. We have done this externalization agenda for 20 years, and we are becoming more, maybe just more open and blunt in what we are doing, and that's meant to be analytical, and what you do with it is your decision.
Thank you very much. Well, by the way, your reference to Morocco made me think that, Morocco has its own sentence in the European Council conclusion. The European Council condemns and rejects any attempt by third countries to instrumentalize migrants for political purposes. So, fine. Right.
Well, I think that sentence most recently was meant for Mr. Lukashenko. Who's actively shipping Iraqi migrants to the Lithuanian border, and I think a bit more remotely for Mr. Erdogan as well. Just if I can add, if I can build just a word on what Daniel just said about the externalization. If you want to look into that from an analytical point of view, study what the US has been doing in the Caribbean, what the US called maritime interdiction. The US has learned from mass maritime migration from Cuba, from Haiti, and so on, and have pursued very consistently exactly these policies. Every administration in the last 20 years, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter, and with results, if that's the results you want to see. And look at it. It is a very interesting topic to study. I'm not saying it's not controversial. It's criticized by some. It's supported by others. But it's a very interesting thing to do. And so I think in that sense also the EU is not really alone. Let me try to answer some of the questions. Migration, positive or bad, or negative, or how is it perceived by member states? I think that's very, very complex. I'm not sure I even want to attempt to answer it. There's a lot of sort of subjective elements to that. I think what is difficult with the asylum/migration debate we're talking about is that we're talking about mixed flows that member states have not agreed to beforehand, if I can try and put it in those words, probably a bit clumsy. I try to use those words to oppose it to regulated legal migration. If you look at some of the member states, the V4, Poland, Poland is very much sort of portrayed as against relocation, against having more migrants, and so on and so forth. If you look at Eurostat data, in terms of work permits, legal migration, Poland is probably #1 per capita currently in the European Union. So there's a lot of openness towards migration in Poland and from the Polish government, from the Polish administration. But it's a chosen migration, probably from certain regions from which they agree to have migration. So it's not black and white. So it is very complex, I think, as an issue and as a debate. But I think the complexity here in the asylum migration issue is that it is those are migratory movements that member states have not chosen, and that if you look at, again, the data, I think, and please correct me if it's not, I think we stand at 70% of refusals on asylum requests, meaning that 70% of those applying for asylum are deemed not to be in need of international protection, and hence being in some way irregular migrants or seen as irregular migrants or irregular economic migrants and so on. So people at least where, the system found them as not being in need of international protection. Hence what makes this debate so difficult. The question about the way ahead and status quo. I meant the status quo more around the issue of should we move from sort of the current system in terms of responsibility and division of responsibility between member states, or move to a system as proposed in the Pact, where you have a strong solidarity element via flexible solidarity, flexible relocation, or more or less mandatory. So that's where I opposed the two. And since it seems that one is not, well, at least for the moment, we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, maybe we need to look at other solutions. Option 1 said we continue on the current negotiation, meaning there is a proposal on the table, we're negotiating it in good faith. And at some point, we'll have to see where we come out. I mean, it is complex. It will take still months, if not more, to look at the complexity, the details of it, see what is linked to it, try to understand it, move text around, try to put amendments on the table and so on. And all that is happening. I mean, it's not like the council is not working on it. I mean, there's hundreds of working hours, meeting hours going into this. So, and at some point, yes, we will hit sort of the roadblock and say, okay, are we somewhere where we see a compromise, a qualified majority emerging, or not? And if not, well, then maybe other avenues are necessary. And I would like to add one element here, which is also makes the negotiations extremely difficult, which is one of the features of which I'm otherwise a great supporter, which is the rotating presidency in the council. But on a complex issue like this one, where the negotiations span over at least half a dozen presidencies, meaning 3 years, it is very, very difficult, to say the least, for each and every rotating presidency to come in, take it up again, be into the file, understand the complexity itself, understand the complexity of the negotiating dynamics, and so on and so forth. And even going into a negotiation, knowing that you will probably not get a result at the end. It's most presidencies, most member states, when they enter their presidency, they look at what is on the table, what can I achieve? Okay, this is doable, this is doable, this is doable, this is doable. Frankly, it's very difficult on the Pact when you enter a presidency to say, okay, we'll do this. I mean, that would be, I think, overzealous, probably even for any presidency. So that makes it very difficult. So we might have to reflect also here on finding different ways of approaching this negotiation. in a way, the situation is so blocked that you might need some negotiating techniques that are coming more from sort of peace processes and others with neutral go-betweens that over the long run try to prepare the ground, shuttling between groups of member states, trying to build elements that work and so on. Because a classical negotiation in the working party, I think in this particular context, was probably going to be difficult to produce results because of just the sheer complexity of the file and the divisions that exist among member states.
Well, thank you very much, Raoul, mostly for these last very insightful comments about, I mean, the environment of the negotiation. I mean, it's another element to be add to the negotiation dynamics that you were referring to since the beginning of your presentation. Yes, I tend to agree with you, but okay, what the rotating presidency is also confronted with conflicting priorities. That you see that they cannot invest their capital, their political capital, in all files which they inherited. And some of these files do come on their agenda with deadlines attached. I mean, climate change comes with a deadline attached. I mean, the implementation of the RRP, the Recovery and Resilience Strategy, come with deadlines attached. So, I mean, they cannot escape that. So, therefore, of course, as there is still no political pressure, there is still no political deadline attached to the negotiation of the pact. I mean, even the presidency, who is aware that it should do something about that, will dedicate its resources, its troops, to other more pressing priorities, objectively more pressing priorities. This is also a conflicting, the difficulty to reconcile conflicting agenda. Concerning your suggestion, I mean, having followed from far some UN peace process, negotiation peace process, I would not dare to use that as an example, because I mean, if the background is negative, I mean, if you are confronted with parties, look at, for instance, at the protracted peace process in Syria, I mean, or Yemen, for instance, I mean, you can have dozens of envoys traveling and shuttling between different countries for years. I mean, they will still not deliver simply because the political will to accommodate is not there. And of course, the most difficult thing will be at a certain point in time to reach compromise which are acceptable. Because people, I mean, I come back to what your example, for instance, of the European Asylum Agency, and we can certainly further elaborate on that during the second part. Okay, I mean, indeed, I mean, some very key provisions had to be given up, and what is worrying is that it was exactly about what member states do not want. That's to say about monitoring what they do, which is, by the way, quite not such a good sign with regard to the future of the Schengen system, for instance. But okay, at least there is something, and at least, okay, that's always the famous half full, half empty bottle, and at least there is this type of progress that can be booked. I was quite impressed by the question that you asked about, okay, migration and how we approach migration and the narrative about migration. I mean, I'm as hesitant as Raoul to answer your question, and I cannot hide between the analytical approach of an academic like you, for instance. But it is a very, very crucial social and societal question that we have to be confronted with. I mean, it will take ages to answer this question in a positive way. It will take a generation, I mean, to enter that. And of course, what you hinted at, I mean, very, very prudently, and I agree with this prudence, I mean, tells also a lot about what kind of migration. What kind of migration do you want? I mean, it's not only about economic criteria, it has also to do with cultural criteria, for instance. And we have to call a spade from time to time. But yet, that will happen. I mean, in a globalized world, you cannot think that by tomorrow, okay, yes, indeed, traveling by air might become more expensive in the future and more difficult, but you cannot expect that people will just be stuck where they are at a time. I mean, all other flows will keep on mushrooming worldwide. So, I mean, we have to bear that in mind. It's not that much about negative. I mean, I used to work for Antonio Vitorino when he was commissioner in charge of Justice and Home Affairs, and he used to say migration is, what was his sentence? Is neither a threat, not an opportunity, it's a reality. And so, I mean, it is as simple as that, and we have to live with it, but with many political interpretation. Concerning the relation with third countries, fine, I'm in a minority of one. Yes, indeed, and I might have misinterpreted the sentence that I was referring to in the European Council, but still it shows, I mean, a danger of the way we are approaching this, is that by being forceful about imposing migration on the top of our agenda with a series of third countries and leaders of third countries we would not like to spend our holidays with, we end up being hostage to them. I mean, I'm keenly aware of the benefits because I managed the facility for refugees in Turkey when I was in charge of humanitarian aid, and it helped delivered. It helped delivered. But okay, in a way, it definitely limited the scope of the dialogue that we can have, or that we might wish to have nowadays with Mr. Erdogan concerning a series of very problematic line that or decision that he is taken either internally or externally. One could say, yes, but at least it forces you to speak to Mr. Erdogan. We don't speak to Mr. Putin, but we still keep on speaking with Mr. Erdogan. So we have to have a somewhat mixed, I keep on having mixed feelings about this. I mean, we negotiated deals we should not be proud of at the time with Mr. Gaddafi in Libya, because, I mean, we needed Mr. Gaddafi to be on board. We are member states, by the way. I mean, it was not always the Union, it was done by member states. So I think that we should have a more balanced approach of where migration management do stand in the list of the priority of our, the hierarchy of our priorities when entering into relation with third countries. It should not necessarily be at the top of each and every agenda, as there is a tendency to see it nowadays. Philippe, I think that time has come for a coffee break.
Yeah, or we can see if we have a question online.
Question online.
No, I close it actually, Philippe, because I thought we were going to close at 4:30.
Okay, then the question online will come for the next session. Okay. Maître de cérémonie, so 15 minutes break?
Yes, 15 minutes break.
15 minutes break, okay. Enjoy your coffee, enjoy your cigarette.